NATO summit and Daddy Trump, the fallout from America's bombing raids on Iran, anti-Semitism at Glastonbury, and the BBC continuing its love-in with Reform UK. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast, Tuesday edition. And once more, I'm joined by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. Yesterday, we focused on all things domestic politics, of course, highlighting Labour's first year in office. Today, we're going to look at some of the things that have been happening across the globe, starting, as always, I suppose, these days, with Donald Trump, his appearance at the NATO summit, and also the aftermath of the bombing exercise that he authorised on Iran. So let's start with that first, actually. Jim, you weren't with us last week when we talked about the decision of America to send the planes over to Iran and bomb those potential nuclear facilities. And there's been a controversy afterwards as to how much damage was actually done to Iran's nuclear capabilities. That being said, I think it would be fair to suggest that Donald Trump will be feeling pretty pleased with himself, because following that attack, although initially the ceasefire didn't hold, the Israelis and the Iranians appear to have behaved themselves since, and he has met his objective of what he described would be a 12-day war and then bringing relative peace to the region. So Donald Trump, as I say, I think will be feeling relatively pleased with himself following that mission.
Yes, in the short term, I think that's the case. And so we have Iran now with, because it was very interesting how the rest of the Arab world kept largely silent about it, particularly the Sunni Arab states, because Iran is a Shia state, because they've regarded Iran as a pain in the bottom, frankly, destabilizing the Middle East. And so their relative silence was very instructive. So I think they're pleased that Iran's been taken down a peg or two. And of course, Iran suffered defeat for its surrogates like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. The Houthis still seem to be fairly troublesome in the southern Arabian area. So yes, in the short term, but my fundamental questions are, I've been dying to say this on this podcast. There were satellite photographs of the trucks outside the place where they really thought the centrifuges were, and they were obviously taking away the enriched uranium. But there's almost a sort of impression that we don't know where it is. I mean, given that Iran has been heavily penetrated by Israeli intelligence, what game is being played with us that we don't know whether they've still got their enriched uranium? I think the Israelis and probably the Americans know where that stuff's been trucked to. And if they don't, then we really are in trouble, because what I think is that Iran now will be tempted in deep secrecy, if they've still got the materials to do it, to make a nuclear bomb, because nobody suggests, Donald Trump doesn't suggest doing to North Korea what he did to Iran. And Iran will feel even more now that if they could get an atomic bomb, that they could then stop the pressure on them. So I think this is, I agree with you. In the short term, it's, he's probably heading for this obscene award of a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, I just can't get my head around that. But yeah, so an end to it for the moment. But the Gaza crisis goes on. So I think this is just a a welcome relief for the world, quite frankly, because there was all sorts of. Although I think the idea that the Straits of Hormuz would have been closed was actually not practical because China needs all the oil it can get from the Persian Gulf, and I don't think the Iranians would have done that.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of where we're at the moment, James. Although Mr. Trump, President Trump rather, would suggest that this is going to be a longer term peace because otherwise woe betide anybody who crosses him. What's interesting that he berated the Israelis as much as he did the Iranians after that initial mission, bombing mission that he'd authorized, because he said after that, Joe, didn't he? Right, that's it, a ceasefire. And then the Israelis went and bombed Iran. Iran retaliated. And to be fair to Donald Trump, and we're not often fair on this podcast to the orange one, he did come out and berate both of them, didn't he?
Yeah, but, that's meaningless. While we were all looking at Iran, what was going on in Gaza? More of the same, murder. It is absolutely atrocious that this is getting worse by the day. People are being shot. They're being sent off to different places where they're being shot. They're being shot queuing for food. There's no aid getting through. There's starvation, a man-made famine. And, what are we doing? We've got the willy-waving warmongers having fun and not doing anything sensible. And I think Iran... it may or may not have been a good thing. I still think it was a Netanyahu who played Trump, and he fell for it. And meanwhile, Putin was meeting with Iran's foreign minister. So I think, all of these things, it's not personally how I would set about going for a Nobel Peace Prize. But hey, what do I know?
Yeah. I think what you'd have to say, though, Joe, from Trump's perspective, is that the Middle East has been a powder keg for generations.
Forever.
What he's saying is that he wants to try and draw a line under this. Some people would say, well, good luck with that, but equally, he's got to try. And I absolutely hear what you say in terms of the horrific situation that still exists in Gaza. Although, again, Donald Trump, I think it was yesterday, made a statement saying he expects that particular conflict to come to an end sooner rather than later. All of this is a nightmare in a sense to Netanyahu, because without these forever wars, he will have to face the consequences of the corruption charges he's long time faced in terms of the Israeli court. So we will see how that plays out. We are always going to be skeptical, James, of the United States president, this current occupant in the White House, of both its motives and the tactics that he is using. But on foreign policy matters, whether we like it or not, he does appear to be able to put his size 11s into a place and get people to bend to his will.
Yes, and shall we go on to the NATO summit now and the daddy experience and so on? Yes, he does. It's just the price that we're all paying for this. I mean, if you say the results justify the ends, then fair enough. But, Trump is getting world leaders, or more certainly NATO leaders, to bend to his will. But, the sort of traditions of institutional collaboration, calm discussion about things, predictability of foreign policy is all out of the window. And, we are paying a price, because I thought it was quite demeaning the way the NATO summit was shortened so that, won't be any discussion about Ukraine. And, Donald might fly off at a moment's notice. We are paying a heavy price for this. But in terms of what you're saying, which is that NATO has not been paying the bill for its own defence, and that has been to some extent guaranteed, although we'll have to see in the outturn what happens. He has achieved that result of waking NATO up, but it's coming at a price. And just to refer back to telling off Netanyahu. The very latest news on the Trump-Netanyahu relationship is that Donald Trump's telling the Israeli courts to lay off his poor friend and more or less drop the corruption charges.
Interesting, and he's not one for getting involved in the court usually, Donald. So what a surprise that is.
But that's my point. There's interfering with the judicial system of another country. This is what I'm talking about. This man just sweeps through all the normal protocols that you expect for a proper international order and respect for each individual country's internal matters. And we had it here with his former mate firing off opinions about child abuse in this country and how we weren't a liberal country and weren't allowing free speech. Anyway.
No, he does, as I say, put his size 11s in, but then he gets deference from other world leaders, and brings me on to my point, Joe, the General Secretary of NATO, Daddy Trump. What did you make of that?
I actually wanted to vomit. I find it so obnoxious and so demeaning. And I think, you can be respectful, you can be deferential if you like, whatever we think of him. He is probably the most powerful man certainly in the Western world. And I think, Keir Starmer has been accused of fawning when he went on his first trip to the Oval Office, and getting out the invitation from the King it was a book token, wanted to prize giving. And I think, there is a point where, hang on a minute, and Jim's absolutely right. Yes, not at any price, and not at the price of dignity. Because whilst Trump is parading around the world and we're all going, oh, let's not upset him. Okay, we'll do whatever he says. We'll fawn all over him. He's dismantling democracy in America. And that in the end will have a huge impact on all of us. And what he's doing with the judiciary there, never mind science, medicine, academia, the arts and everything else, is so damaging that I think we would do well we can be polite, but we should actually just keep a distance. And I was really surprised at Mark Rutte, because he's a cold fish, and I really thought this is just beyond the pale. It made me nauseated in the extreme.
I think what it did for me, Joe, was confirm what we were saying last week, in a sense, is that these big international institutions like the United Nations, like NATO, are becoming more and more irrelevant, because actually it's what Trump says goes, in a sense. Yeah. And we've not talked about the lack of influence Trump has had over Putin, actually. And I guess you will put, as Jim referred to it, China in the same category, wouldn't you? That they're not listening to what Donald Trump has to say. But the rest of the world, Europe in particular, seems to be fawning all over him, as you say. Meanwhile, back at the ranch in the United States itself, then he's likely to get his big, beautiful Bill Act through, despite all the controversy surrounding that. Just to put this into context, what this means is an extra $2 trillion of debt onto the Americans' bill, which is already significant, tax cuts for the rich, and cuts to Medicaid. So, talk about taking from the poor, giving to the rich, then that's Donald Trump's playbook, basically. And that bill is likely to go through this week. At the same time, as you both sort of alluded to, he's challenging the judiciary in the States at every turn and ripping up the Constitution. It's dangerous stuff, Jim.
Yes, and the things are going his way at the moment. I mean, as we've previously discussed, he was lucky enough to be able to appoint 3 Supreme Court judges in his first term in office because of death or resignation, which is unusual to make 3 nominations for life in one presidency. And he's getting the benefits of that. Last week, an important ruling that the lower courts couldn't thwart him. And particularly on the question of whether people born in America have a right to be regarded as American citizens, which he wants to challenge. And he's now got a ruling that the lower courts can't do that. So we're seeing and Congress seems to be pretty enfeebled. So we're sort of seeing, all the things we learnt at school about the way in which the checks and balances work, and the criticism in the past has been that the United States political system is too full of checks and balances and prevents decisions being made. But this guy is sort of bypassing everything and saying, well, you can take it to the courts, but by the time they've decided, I'll be over the hills and far away. So it is, there are elements of worry about that. I'm not sure I've been on the podcast since the National Guard were deployed in California, which was clearly an over-the-top thing. The spectacle of that. I don't want to exaggerate it, because I just can't believe that the American people, that democracy is not deeply rooted in the United States, and there won't be a substantial challenge to it. But you can see the sort of, you seize control of the institutions, you intimidate the press, you get powerful business on side, and that is the beginning of a structure of an authoritarian regime.
And not to mention his interference with the media. We're going to come on to the implications of that in the UK a bit later on, but he's not shy in terms of simply ripping up the credibility of any news channel that disagrees with his narrative. He did that after that bombing mission, where CNN simply reported what they'd been told by the officials, that mission was not as successful as Peter Hesketh had initially said. And yet the media mostly have been frit of taking Trump on, Joe.
Yeah, and as Jim says, I mean, that is the beginning of you making an authoritarian state. It's what happens in Russia. It's what happens in parts of the Middle East. It's what happens in other parts of the world that we are appalled by. And America, which holds up this, the right to free speech, but not if it's something that I disagree with. I mean, the other thing that I find staggering, well, two things. One is a good thing or an interesting thing is the possibility of a new mayor for New York, who is, not the favourite, but this sort of left-wing firebrand young guy. And the other thing that I find deeply distressing is the murder in her own home. We talked about it with Kevin last week, of the Minnesota senator and her husband. We still talk about, quite rightly, the murders of Joe Cox and David Amis in this country. That happened in America, in their own homes, this woman and her husband. And it's sort of like, it's just sort of taken for granted. Move on. Nobody's talking about it. There should be soul searching. There should be absolute horror and a hold on a minute. We've got to stop this. We've got to tone things down. But no, we just carry on. And I find it deeply, deeply distressing, actually.
No, it is incredible how quickly we move on from issues these days in terms of the news cycle. And we've stopped talking about the LA riots already, haven't we?
Forgotten. Yeah.
As Jim has mentioned, in putting the National Guard in place. Zoran Mamdani, I hope I've pronounced the gentleman's name correctly. He is the left-wing firebrand, 33-year-old, who took on the traditional Democrat, which was Andrew Cuomo, who'd, I think, been accused a few years ago of some sexual picadillos in his office, if memory serves me correctly. And surprisingly, he lost the nomination to run for mayor. Alongside that, we've also seen Gavin Newsom sharpen his elbows. He's actually taking Fox News to court and suing them for £800 million for basically editing incorrectly a comment he made about a conversation with Donald Trump over that decision to impose the National Guard on his state. And so Gavin Newsom's clearly starting to, as I say, sharpen his elbows and I guess get ready for a presidential run. I'm not suggesting this young man in New York is going to run for president. What it does indicate, though, is that AOC will likely be the left-wing firebrand who puts her hat in the ring for the presidential nomination. James, I suggest to you that this is all great news for Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
Yes, there's no sign of the Democrats yet resolving their post-election debate about which way they go. The New York thing, I mean, it's not, New York's not all America, of course, but it would suggest that the radical wing of the Democratic Party is still a force to be reckoned with. And Gavin Newsom, I think, will increasingly loom up as the middle of the road, the more traditional Democratic candidate. But at the moment, they're not really standing up to Trump in a consistent way in the Congress. The big beautiful bill that you referred to earlier is there are a few Republicans who are concerned about it, and its passage is not entirely guaranteed. And you almost want to see that happen, because it would give us some hope that it's not becoming, as Joe says, a bit of a dictatorship. But the Democrats are deeply in trouble. But I mean, this is a worldwide phenomenon. That the sort of left of centre parties generally are struggling with the populist trend that's being fueled, and also by the need for defence expenditure. That tends to be difficult for the left. I'm generalising now, but around the world, countries arming up. It's a difficult argument for the left to deal with, and I don't. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen, whether there will be a big Democrat revival in the midterm elections, which are still 18 months away. But at the moment, I mean, this is the problem. Kamala Harris is defeated and she disappears. And there's a guy called Chuck Schumer that nobody's ever heard of, certainly internationally, who's sort of leader of the opposition. But there isn't a leader of the opposition in America. It's very curious. So it always happens. But on this occasion, when you've got a really powerful president driving forward, the Democrats haven't got their act together at all yet.
No, and I suppose it'd be less of a problem if Trump was seen to be flailing, but he's had a successful first few months in office by his measurement, and by those of the MAGA base. They would say he's doing everything he said he would. So the point that was made by Clinton's former advisor, can't think of his name at this moment in time, but let's just sit back and let this all fall apart. Well, that's okay if things are falling apart. But when things seem to be going in the direction that the president wants, then that's less of a good argument to make. I just want to finally, before we move back home to Glastonbury, get your thoughts on this commitment that's been made by NATO countries to up their spending to 5% by 2035. We talk often about politicians kicking the can down the road, and that struck me as something that European leaders have thought, well, surely by then we'll have someone sane in the White House. I'm not sure, Joe, whether they're going to get away with that this time, because this conversation about Europe and the other NATO nations outside the United States not paying their way was actually started by Barack Obama. So I think whoever comes into the White House in 3.5 years' time will be saying to NATO that commitment needs to be met.
Well, it goes back further than Barack Obama, actually, Frank. It goes back to Jack Kennedy. Goes back to the 1960s. So
Jim reported on it.
Jim was there, obviously. I was just but a wee girl. But I think, it's been ongoing. And I think if you think of Trump as a deal maker, which is what he likes to think of himself, what he's done, he's got a commitment. Now, whether or not he holds people, or his successor holds people to it, but I think what it's done, it's made a commitment much stronger. And we've seen what's happened in Germany, where they have, actually they've changed their sort of fiscal rules in order to borrow money to spend it on defence. What we've seen from the UK's point of view and other countries is that within that 5% is also a 1.5% on resilience building, which could be cybersecurity or could be rural broadband. If you're going to have Dad's Army in the Norfolk Fens, that's what you need, isn't it? So, there are ways of doing it, but I think the commitment is there. I think the understanding is there. amongst NATO countries that they can't kick the can down the road for much longer. And I think, you know, the threat that we've seen from Russia in Ukraine is very, very real. So, you know, even without Trump, it should focus minds on a stronger and more united and coherent European defence strategy.
Okay, well, let's move on to Glastonbury. And I never thought we'd be discussing a music festival in the UK in terms of its geopolitical commentary. Okay, we had a few people chanting 3 or 4 years ago Jeremy Corbyn's name. Well, it's probably 6 years ago now, isn't it? Whatever happened to that fella? Oh, he's still an MP, isn't he? May form his own political party, I'm told. Well, good luck, Jeremy. Hope it's as successful as the last time you led a fucking party. But the thing is, James, the BBC are getting some stick because we're streeting the Prime Minister. Jackie was saying this morning yesterday morning on Times Radio that the BBC need to ask themselves questions of the way in which this particular shout of "kill the IDF," I think was the chant from the singer whose name escapes me. I don't think we want to give him any particular publicity anyway.
Bob Dylan.
Oh, that's him. Yeah, Bob Dylan. Okay, but right. Jim, I'm less critical of the BBC because how are you supposed to know what bands are going to shout and scream on stage in a live act at Glastonbury? But overall, what do you make of this? Do you think, as I do, that yes, the guys should be picked up and questioned by police because that's a consistency of approach in terms of people taking to a public platform and using threatening language and threatening behaviour, but it's being blown up more so because it is the BBC, if that makes sense.
Right, okay, well, as this is likely to be a two-part conversation, I'm going to save up my defence of the BBC for another matter that you might raise later in the podcast. On this occasion, I think the BBC have got into unnecessary trouble. There was a simple way round this. It's called the delay button. They had plenty of advance notice that this particular act. I'm leaving aside the other people, but that he was liable to say something out of place, and you can put a delay button on. And then this could have been avoided. It could have been blanked out, or ultimately they could have switched to one of, because they had multiple cameras and services. There were about 5 channels. You could watch all the stages over the weekend. I watched the Maccabees late last night, so I had an entertaining weekend, one way or the other. And so I think that could and should have been done. I do criticise the BBC for actually broadcasting it, and it's not available on demand to watch now, so they're obviously sensitive about it. You know, the BBC have got into a lot of difficulties over Gaza recently and Gaza-related issues. The second programme that they commissioned after the controversy over broadcasting a programme where the son of the commentator, the young boy who was commentating, was found out to be the son of a Gaza health official. The second programme is now going to be transmitted by Channel 4, the BBC having banned it. So they do seem to get into great difficulty. But I think on this, a delay button could have been put on. Some people said there should have been a BBC political advisor in the gallery. I mean, I would have thought that even the music producers, you know enough about politics to know that this particular gentleman could have caused problems. So I do criticise the BBC on this front. They could have taken technical measures to. I mean, it's not a great look when you know. I can see how it would have looked. You know, suddenly silence and that sort of thing, and then you get the censorship argument. But I think there were technical ways of avoiding this gentleman's obnoxious attitudes being broadcast.
It's really simple. If you're watching a football match or you're screening a football match, I've done lots and lots of outside broadcasts, and you have something like a catastrophic injury or something like that, you know, you do not zoom in on the player and you cut. You either go back to the studio, or as Jim rightly says, they've got enough bloody cameras. I mean, half the BBC are in Glastonbury, and they did have political reporters there, and they've got umpteen outside broadcasts and goodness knows what coverage. You just cut it and you go to another stage. And The problem, of course, now is the BBC look incompetent, and whoever was the director or producer should have just said, cut it, go to another stage or something, and be prepared for censorship argument. But now you have got to be seen to question this chap and possibly prosecute him, because you've got Reform and other commentators baying for the release of Lucy Connolly, the woman who urged people to go out and set fire to hostels with migrants in, not caring if they died. But you've got to be seen to do the same, because otherwise you're going to end up in this turmoil of two-tier justice. And you have to say, all right, Glastonbury, frankly, I don't know which is worse, Glastonbury or Jeff Bezos' wedding. I mean, both of them leave me absolutely cold. But it's going to be a bit political, because that's what rock and roll's supposed to be. It's going to be political slogans and things, until you get to dear old Rod Stewart, obviously. But you've got to have a little bit of common sense and just be prepared to pull it.
Yeah, even Rod Stewart came out politically in favour of Nigel Farage in the Times on Saturday.
Yeah, but that was in the Times. That wasn't on the.
I was surprised
he got.
Yeah, I'm surprised he didn't get more stick from the Glastonbury crowd. But there you go. We're very forgiving of 81-year-olds, as we are on this podcast. So you've convinced me. You've convinced me. You're both experienced broadcasters, and the point you make, and well make, is that the BBC could have easily put a delay button on, and every live radio programme that I've ever been on has got that delay button. So yeah, you're quite right. They should have been better prepared. In terms of the prosecution of the guy concerned, it's inevitable, isn't it? Because as you say, Joe, there's already this uproar of two-tier policing, and so the idea that he's not now going to get dragged in and questioned, and whether or not he goes to Nick for it, but certainly I'm sure he'll be prosecuted. And then this other group, NECAP, I think they were banned from BBC coverage, weren't they? The Irish band, so not as controversial in a sense. It does then, I think, start to feed into, though, some of this right-wing rhetoric of where free speech starts and where it ends. And I think this is where people on the left, such as us, need to be careful, because we can't have it all ways. We can't say, well, Lucy Connolly can't talk to her Twitter followers, all of whom I guess it has fucking cracked his hair, and say that you should go and burn down a hotel full of immigrants, and then say it's okay for a guy to stand on the stage simply because it's a rock concert and call for the murder of the Israeli Defence Force. So I think you've got to be consistent in your approach as far as that's concerned. But the BBC, didn't help themselves. I was far more upset, though, at the BBC on Thursday night, a programme I can't bear to watch anymore, sadly, which is Question Time, which this week, to keep the international flavour running, came from Scotland, which I'm sure is heading for independence if we continue to fail as a government as we are in this country. And they basically had a panel which consisted of the usual suspects, with it being Scotland, the Scottish National Party, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. But of course, also represented in the Scottish Assembly are the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. So imagine my surprise when I found that there were neither a Green nor a Liberal Democrat panel member on the programme, but the representative of a political party who is yet to win a seat in the Scottish Assembly, a councillor from, guess where, Joe?
Don't tell me, the turquoise land of dreams and unicorns.
Reform. And at this point, it is indefensible to suggest that that was a reasonable decision to make. I go back to what we said previously. The editorial call from the BBC certainly needs to be questioned. But equally, why aren't the Liberal Democrats and the Greens absolutely screaming turquoise murder, never mind blue murder, about some of this nonsense, the coverage that this fourth party are getting from our main broadcaster. Jim, tell me why I'm wrong.
The fourth party in terms of the last general election, that's probably what you're referring to, that is historic matter that happened over a year ago. The more contemporary picture is that Reform are leading in the opinion polls. They did very well in Scotland, which was a remarkable result in the Hamilton by-election for a party that explicitly is very much in favour of Brexit in a country that voted to remain. So that was a notable political advance for them. And the BBC is obliged, I've been desperately, viewers may have been watching my head turning to one side and not paying attention to the contributions, but I've been trying to look up the particular guidelines of the BBC, but I'm pretty certain that it says that as well as paying attention to the formal standing of political parties following election results, they have to bear in mind the current position. And therefore, you are going to see more of Reform UK on programmes like Kunsberg and BBC Question Time. And I think that the Scottish woman was on because of the Hamilton situation. But I've got even worse news for you, Frank, because the BBC is understood to be it is looking at its guidelines, not only for news, but also for drama, to ensure it represents all audiences in their concern, suggesting the broadcaster may look to boost its coverage of issues such as immigration. Because, and I know you'll say they would say this, wouldn't they? But Reform UK faith in the BBC is very low because it thinks it's sort of a liberal institution. So there's no sign of the BBC accepting your protests, I'm afraid.
Well, if we're going to decide who's going to be featured on our mainstream political broadcasts on a weekly basis, based on opinion polls, then I think that is a huge shift from where we've been in the past, because Absolutely. There is no way in the world that the SDP or indeed the SDP Liberal Alliance used to get a weekly slot on Question Time, or indeed used to feature on the Sunday BBC flagship programme. So it's a shift in policy, which I guess is being driven by all those right-wing governors that have still been allowed to serve on the BBC board, which I think is a nonsense in itself. And if I'm saying the Liberal Democrats and the Greens ought to sharpen their elbows, I think the government needs to go in and sort the BBC out. The other point I'd make, Jim, is that this thing about cultural programmes and there being a shift that the BBC needs to take account of. Let's look at the opinion polls then. So even at very best, Reform are polling at around 30%, which means that 70% of us are not as exercised by immigration and the woke culture and all of that sort of nonsense that gets Nigel Farage the headlines and the sound bites at this moment in time. So I would simply say to the BBC, think of the 70% rather than the 30%. But on a more serious note, if you are talking to me about a programme that is coming from Scotland, a year away from a parliamentary election in that country, and two of the parties that are currently represented in the Assembly are excluded then from that programme, I think that is absolutely outrageous. And if the guidelines are saying any different than that, then those guidelines need to be ripped up and we need to relook at them. Because I tell you, Jim, it's an absolute joke. And we go back to the pre-Brexit years, where these people, Farage in particular, in fact, probably Farage almost exclusively, was given that platform by the BBC because, why? A lot of people are saying that we should come out of the European Union. And look where that led us to. We rolled the dice, we had Brexit. Surely at some point the BBC needs to take a look at itself and say, should we really be in the business of promoting a political movement on the basis of an opinion poll rating when we've got two parties in the Greens and the Liberal Democrats who've got far more elected representatives across the country than Reform have? I can't see your argument, Jim. I'm sorry.
all I would say is that people who, you know, every person I speak to, apart from Nigel Farage, obviously, thinks that it's absolutely ridiculous, the amount of coverage, the free publicity that Reform get, and the lack of coverage for Greens and the Liberal Democrats. But all I would say to people is write to the BBC, because they won't take any notice unless they get stuff, and they will send out. In fact, my next door neighbour showed me a letter that he'd got, which was, oh, well, you know, we do it on a news by news basis, and Reform got 4 million votes, and therefore blah, 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 you know, all that sort of nonsense. But unless people say to the BBC, this is ridiculous, I'm not paying my licence fee to support Reform or to see your editorial fairness go out of the window. I mean, you know, I will defend the BBC as well as Jim up to a certain point, but this Reform stuff is ridiculous. And if I was doing, I've said it before, if I was doing my old job for the Liberal Democrats, I'd be on the phone every 5 minutes and writing letters and complaining about lack of balance, because it's not. I mean, I don't have a problem with drama. You know, drama has always been, you know, looking at difficult issues, whether it's homelessness with Cathy Come Home, or, you know, teenage pregnancy, or
generally from a left-wing perspective, actually.
Generally from a left-wing perspective, but it, you know, it's done things that have made people feel uncomfortable, you know, and it may be that it's time for it to go the other way. I don't have a problem with that. That's what drama's for. You know, look at the success of Adolescence, for instance. Right? I know that was Netflix, but I do think when it comes to politics, particularly,
can you conceive of a drama being made which is centered around a predominantly white community in Oldham or something, where their community changed massively because of immigration, and perhaps looking at it from that point of view, you know, and actually saying, without being racist, that these people now feel uncomfortable. Can you imagine a drama series being made from that point of view? I mean, because that's the sort of thing that hasn't happened.
Well, yes, I can. I mean, and I'm sure there are people out there. I'm sure there are talented writers, you know, who would come up with that. And I think, you know, there are, if they can find them, and they can find the production crew and production teams and companies to do it, then that's absolutely fine. I mean, that's what the BBC should be doing. But when it comes to news and politics, I think they really, but I think everybody should write and complain.
Just 2 quick points, you know, because we're not going to agree about this. I think you'll find that Michael Foot's Labour Party was outraged at the amount of coverage that the SDP did get when it was formed. I mean, I can remember Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams. They were never off the screens in 1982.
For the same reason, because they were new and it was interesting and it was a news story. But the election was a year ago, and as Frank said, the election in Scotland is not imminent around the corner. So there is no editorial justification, and certainly not having a councillor, not even a council leader, up against MPs. I mean, that's
and you see, the thing is, you keep moving the goalposts, Jim, because Farage has been featuring on the BBC for a decade now. Now, he's never had poll ratings like this before. Never.
Exactly.
So what was the excuse for the fact that the guy appeared on Question Time more times than any other politician in the history of the programme? When he wasn't polling 30%, he was lucky to be polling 3% during those periods of time. And yet the BBC was still giving the guy coverage. And so if we're going to have an even playing field, you can't switch the rules and the story to suit your particular editorial policy in a particular week. And for me, the way in which I've always viewed these things, and there was no way that the SDP were on the television every week on Question Time, on that flagship Sunday programme, in the same way as Reform have been. Have a look at your records, Jim, because I know you keep diaries as far as this is concerned. And that didn't happen. I promise you that didn't happen. And the SDP were, I think, polled nearly 50% on some occasions, didn't they? So it just didn't happen. But as I say, you can't have it all ways. You can't say to me, well, it's because they're polling really well now, and then explain to me why Nigel Farage featured 999 times on Question Time when he was polling at 3%.
The SDP, We must end
Well,
this
no,
thing.
stick to that question.
Yeah,
no,
no,
stick to that question.
I've
How
got to
was
push back on
Nigel
you. You say,
Farage
check
featuring
my
on
records.
Question Time every other week
Yeah.
when he was polling at about 3%?
Yeah, but I'm just going to push back. The SDP in 1982 had a rolling conference that went from Dundee. It was ridiculous. They had 2 days in Dundee, 2 days in the Midlands, and 2 days in Torquay. And I covered. I was at all three of them, and that was the level. That was the level of media coverage of the SDP.
It was a party conference, Jim. But
The
you've
only
not
other
answered
thing-
my question. No, answer my question. If you're saying that it's all to do with their poll ratings, then can you explain to me why Nigel Farage appeared on north of 20 occasions on Question Time when they were not polling higher than 3 or 4%? If it's all about the polls, why was he appearing on Question Time every other week?
And we're sort of going back to sort of 2010-ish from there onwards, that sort of thing.
Over a decade, wasn't it?
Yes, for over a decade, and no one's more pro-European than I am. Nigel Farage was a very articulate, and the fact of the matter is the media will go for articulate people. That's just a fact. And amusing to some extent, his delivery style and so on. But the substantial issue was that he was the champion of a growing movement for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, which was arguably the most important news story that's happened in the last decade and a half. And it
was an important news story partly because of the amount of bloody time the BBC gained to Nigel Farage. So can we expect over the next 12 months, James, Jeremy Corbyn, who is also a very articulate individual, some would say quite amusing, and his colleagues who are very pro-Palestinian, a growing movement across this country, actually, can we expect to see them being given additional coverage by the BBC? Because by your own admission, the BBC have just decided to ban a documentary that Jeremy and his comrades would very much like to see, and is going to be aired by Channel 4.
Well, there is an issue about how the independents who are threatening people like Wes Streeting and his constituency and how they're covered. That's true. But Corbyn himself has not, led the Labour Party, had a socialist vision, was going up a blind alley. But just one other thing.
James, can I just push back a little on that? Because Jeremy Corbyn may have been going down a blind alley to some, but he, of course, scored in the poll in the 2015, 16, 17 election against Theresa May far more votes, and poll percentage-wise, even more healthily than Nigel Farage is performing at this moment in time in the polls.
Well,
Jeremy Corbyn outperformed him. It was north of 30%. He didn't win, but he scored. We're talking about polls now. And you're the one who brought polls into it. So if we're talking about if you're popular in the polls and how many votes you've won, Jeremy Corbyn, in his career as a politician, has both polled better and won more votes than Nigel Farage ever has.
No, his polls ratings were rather poor, which is why Theresa May called the general election in April 2017 because she thought she could win. She wouldn't have done that if Jeremy Corbyn's poll ratings.
But subsequently polled very well, and his national vote was far more than Reform will ever secure. So why isn't Jeremy Corbyn being given the same sort of coverage and profile as Nigel Farage?
Well, as far as I know, Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party, was given thorough coverage during his period.
What I'm saying is politics now. He's moved into this new political movement of pro-Palestine. BBC don't give them any coverage whatsoever.
Well, A, there's no political party, and B, what's his poll ratings? I mean, they're very low.
Poll ratings, okay.
But you can't
But
do it all
one
on
last thing I want to say
ratings.
is when these people appear, you say it's a platform for their views. When I see them interviewed, I see the rigor of the BBC's journalists being applied and questioning them. I do not regard it as a platform for them just to say whatever they like.
Yeah, well, you can vigorously question me anytime you want, Laura, because I tell you, it'd be like getting savaged by a dead sheep, as Dennis Healy once said. I'm not letting this one go. I can understand, on a serious note, why Nigel Farage may get interviewed from time to time on the BBC. I will even go as far as to say fair enough, Richard Tice. But when you get a fucking councillor that
Exactly.
nobody on the planet has ever heard of, featuring on what used to be a very credible and flagship serious political programme such as Question Time, in a country that is already unrepresented in terms of the voices that represent it on the BBC and other media channels, and you exclude two political parties that have polled much, much better over a much, much longer period of time than Reform have, and have sitting MSPs in the Assembly, to exclude them and to stick on, as I say, a councillor that no bugger has ever heard of, that is absolutely scandalous and is indefensible. And although you were able to convince me, James, that a 7-second delay could have spared the BBC's blushes as far as Glastonbury is concerned, you will never convince me that sticking a bloody councillor on before an MSP from the Greens or the Liberal Democrats is either fair or explainable. I will close the podcast today because I'm in the chair and I can. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening. I will next week post Jim's address so as people can start bloody writing to him. Never mind writing to the Director General of the BBC. Let's sort Jim Hancock out. Have a great week, everyone. We'll be back next Monday and hopefully we'll have some good news to talk about. See you then. Thanks for listening.